The late August wind swept across the Dakota prairie the morning Tobias Lindgren started digging beneath his cabin floor. 3 days had passed since they buried his grandmother. 3 days of silence in a cabin that had never been quiet when she was alive. His neighbors thought he had lost his mind. That was 1878. And in a settlement where every family burned through 4 cords of wood each winter just to survive, watching a 12-year-old orphan excavate a hole under his own house seemed like watching someone dig their own grave. But Tobias kept digging, and by the time the first snow fell 3 months later, he had done something nobody in Pembina County had seen before. He had built a storage chamber that did not exist above ground. What his neighbors could not have known, what nobody understood until 14 families nearly froze to death that winter, was that Tobias had spent 3 years watching his grandmother observe firewood rot. He had watched her document how wood turned to pulp in autumn rains. He had listened as she explained how spring snowmelt transformed cordwood into sponge. He had heard the story of his father, Henrik, who died of pneumonia in their second winter because the wood they had stacked outside stayed too wet to burn hot enough to dry their cabin after a roof leak. The Dakota Territory in the 1870s did not forgive mistakes. It did not give second chances. And Tobias Lindgren was not about to let his grandmother's death mean nothing. The settlement at Cavalier Creek consisted of 23 families spread across 6 square miles of treeless prairie. Most were Norwegian and Swedish immigrants who had arrived between 1875 and 1877, lured by the Homestead Act's promise of 160 acres. They had built their sod houses into hillsides, planted wheat, and prepared for winters they had been told were harsh. But harsh did not capture it. January temperatures dropped to 38 degrees below zero. Blizzards lasted 4 days straight, and the nearest timber, cottonwoods and ash along the Pembina River, lay 7 miles south. That meant every stick of firewood had to be hauled by ox cart and stacked while you had the chance. The problem was never getting the wood. The problem was keeping it dry. Tobias understood this now in ways most adults never would. His grandmother Astrid had taught him to see what others missed. She had spent 3 years documenting the patterns of wood decay, filling a leather-bound journal with observations that read more like science than housekeeping. Wood stacked outside absorbed moisture from snow, rain, and even morning dew. It froze, thawed, froze again. By January, when you needed it most, a third of your wood pile had degraded into rot or held so much moisture it would not burn clean. The smoke it produced was thick, acrid, dangerous. It coated lungs and made children cough through the night. That smoke had killed his father. Henrik Lindgren had been a school teacher back in Kalmar County, Sweden. He had taught his mother Astrid everything about observation and measurement, about thinking in systems rather than traditions. When Henrik married and brought his young wife to Dakota, Astrid had followed. When Henrik's wife died of fever 6 months after Henrik's death from pneumonia, Astrid had taken in 5-year-old Tobias and raised him as her own. For 7 years, she had poured everything she knew into the boy. Now she was gone too. Astrid Lindgren died in her sleep on the 14th of August, 1878. She was 74 years old, and she had spent the last 3 years of her life preparing for a project she would never complete. Beneath the worn floorboards of her cabin, hidden under a loose plank near the iron stove, she had already begun excavating a chamber. 2 feet deep, the beginning of something. Tobias found it 3 days after the funeral, when he finally forced himself to clean the cabin that was now his alone. He moved the plank expecting to find root vegetables or perhaps a small cache of emergency supplies. Instead, he found a hole. And beside the hole, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, he found his grandmother's journal. The pages were filled with her careful handwriting, measurements, calculations, diagrams of a storage chamber that would maintain stable temperature year-round, notes on thermal mass and vapor barriers, on drainage angles and air circulation. 3 years of observations about wood moisture content, rot progression, and burn efficiency. She had been building something revolutionary, and she had left him the instructions to finish it. Tobias sat on the cabin floor for a long time that afternoon, the journal open in his lap, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. His grandmother had known she was dying. She had known, and she had prepared. Not with money or land or possessions, but with knowledge, with a foundation already dug and a blueprint for survival. The boy who had nothing now had everything he needed. He just had to build it. The news spread through Cavalier Creek within days. The Lindgren boy was digging a hole under his cabin floor. Not a root cellar, not a storm shelter. Something else entirely, something his dead grandmother had designed. Magnus Arneson was the first to come see for himself. He was 52 years old, a former ship's carpenter from Bergen who had immigrated 4 years earlier. He had survived Norwegian winters that would kill most men, and he had built structures that withstood North Sea storms. He knew construction, he knew wood, and he knew that a 12-year-old orphan had no business excavating beneath a load-bearing floor. He arrived on the third day when Tobias was hauling his 14th bucket of soil up through the hole he had cut in the floorboards. Magnus stood in the doorway and watched, his Norwegian accent still thick after 4 years in America. The cabin was small, barely large enough for one person. A single room with an iron stove, a bed built into the wall, a table worn smooth by years of use. On the table sat the leather-bound journal, open to a page filled with the calculations that Magnus could not read from the doorway. The smell of fresh earth filled the space. Copper, the hunting dog, lay near the stove with his head on his paws, watching his young master work with patient eyes. The dog had not left Tobias's side since the funeral. He seemed to understand, in the way that dogs sometimes understand, that the boy needed a companion more than ever. Magnus had come expecting to find chaos. Instead, he found systematic progress. The hole in the floor was not random destruction. It was precisely cut, framed with salvaged lumber to prevent the edges from crumbling. The excavation below was not a simple pit, but a carefully shaped space with walls that sloped gently outward to distribute soil pressure. Even the buckets of earth were being dumped in organized piles, separated by soil type for later use. This was not the work of a grieving child acting irrationally. This was the work of someone following a plan. "You are bringing damp into your home," Magnus said. "Earth holds moisture. That wood will mold before Christmas." Tobias did not stop digging. "Earth holds temperature too," he said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "Stays around 50 degrees down there, winter and summer. Water freezes at 32. Wood rots above 65 when it is damp. I am putting my firewood where it will stay dry and stable." Magnus shook his head slowly. "You are wasting effort, boy. We all have sheds." Tobias pulled up another bucket of dark soil and dumped it into the growing pile beside the cabin. He looked at Magnus with eyes that seemed too old for his young face. "How is your firewood burning this winter, Mr. Arneson?" Magnus did not answer. His wood had been smoking badly since November, and they both knew it. 4 other settlers came by that first week, each with their own objections. Friedrich Krauss arrived on the 5th day. He was 48 years old, a former Prussian soldier who had fought in the Franco-Prussian War before homesteading in Dakota. He walked with the rigid posture of a military man, and he spoke with the certainty of someone who had never been wrong about anything important. "Any enclosed space will trap moisture from the earth itself," he announced, standing at the edge of the hole and peering down with obvious disdain. "You will have condensation dripping from your ceiling by January. Underground spaces sweat." He looked at Tobias the way officers looked at new recruits who had made foolish mistakes. "Even grown men could not accomplish what you are attempting, boy. And you are neither grown nor a man." Tobias continued working. He had learned from his grandmother that some arguments could not be won with words. Only results would change minds like Friedrich Krauss's. Helga Bjornstad came on the 6th day, but she came differently than the others. She was 41 years old, practical and observant, mother of 6 children who had all survived frontier childhood. She had buried 2 babies in Sweden before emigrating, and she had learned that survival required watching more than talking. Her husband Anders was a stonemason from Oslo, and she had spent 20 years studying how he assessed structures before passing judgment. She did not offer opinions. She brought food, a loaf of dark bread wrapped in cloth, a small pot of butter, some dried fish that would keep for weeks if stored properly. "You will need your strength," she said simply, setting the food on the table. Then she stood quietly and watched Tobias work for nearly an hour before leaving without another word. She would return every week for the next 4 months, always bringing something, always watching, never criticizing. Tobias did not know it then, but Helga Bjornstad would eventually become the closest thing he would ever have to a mother again. Reverend Elias Holmberg visited on the seventh day. He was the circuit preacher who served Cavalier Creek twice monthly, riding between settlements to bring the word of God to scattered homesteaders. He was 55 years old, well-meaning but traditional, uncomfortable with anything that strayed too far from established practice. "The Lord provides wood above ground, son," he said, his tone gentle but concerned. "It seems we ought to store it the way he intended." Tobias paused in his work and looked up at the Reverend with respect but not deference. "My grandmother believed God gave us minds to solve problems," he said. "She said observing his creation carefully was a form of prayer. Understanding how the earth holds temperature, how moisture moves, how wood decays. She said that was studying his design." The Reverend was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he finally said. "I will pray your observations serve you, as well as her faith served her." He left without condemning the project, which was more than Tobias had expected. Old Sven Lindqvist came on the eighth day. He was 71 years old, one of the oldest settlers in the region, a man who had left Sweden in his 60s when most men his age were settling into their final years. He walked with a cane carved from ash wood, and his eyes held a particular clarity of someone who had seen enough winters to recognize patterns invisible to younger people. Unlike the others, he did not come to criticize. He came to remember. Sven descended into the partially excavated chamber slowly, his old bones protesting every step of the ladder. He stood in the cool earth for a long time, running his gnarled fingers along the walls that Tobias had begun to line with stones. "I know this," he said quietly. "I have seen cellars like this in Dalarna. My grandfather built one when I was a boy your age. He stored timber for winter building, kept it dry through seasons that would rot anything left above ground." Tobias stopped working to listen. "Did it work?" he asked. Sven smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had been. 60 years later, his house still stands. The cellar still keeps stable temperature. Some things, when built correctly, outlast the people who build them. He climbed back up the ladder slowly, pausing at the top to look down at Tobias. "Your grandmother knew the old ways. I recognized her the first time we met, recognized the way she looked at things. She was one of the ones who remembers. There are not many of us left." He paused, and something softened in his weathered face. "She worried about you, you know. Told me once that her greatest fear was leaving you alone before you were ready. She said she was racing against time to teach you everything she knew." Tobias felt his throat tighten. "I did not know she was dying," he said quietly. "She never told me." "She would not," Sven replied. "That was not her way. She wanted your last months together to be about learning, not about grieving. She wanted you focused on the future, not the past." The old man's eyes were moist. "She made me promise to watch over you. Made me promise that if she passed before the chamber was finished, I would make sure the settlement did not take you from your land." "You never came before today," Tobias said. "I was watching," Sven assured him, "from a distance where you would not notice. I saw you hauling buckets. I saw you selecting stones. I saw the skeptics come and go, and I saw you keep working despite their words." He smiled slightly. "Your grandmother would be proud. You have her stubbornness." He tapped his cane against the floor. "Finish what she started, boy. The others will understand when winter comes." It was the first encouragement Tobias had received from anyone in the settlement. He held on to those words during the long weeks that followed. By the end of August, the settlement had reached a consensus about the Lindgren boy. He was touched by grief, working through his loss in an unhealthy way, building something doomed to fail because he could not accept that his grandmother was gone. Ingrid Dahl, the woman who knew everything about everyone in Cavalier Creek, summarized the general opinion when she spoke to her neighbor outside the general store in Pembina. "Poor thing," she said, shaking her head with practiced sympathy, "digging like a mole under his own floor. He will not survive until Christmas. Mark my words." Her words spread through the settlement like all her words did. By September, everyone in Cavalier Creek knew that Tobias Lindgren was a tragedy waiting to happen. What nobody knew was that the tragedy had already happened, and Tobias was building his way out of it. If you have been watching our channel, you know we document these forgotten techniques before they disappear entirely. Hit that like button if you value this kind of practical frontier wisdom. It helps us preserve these stories for others who understand that the old ways often work better than we give them credit for. The chamber that Tobias excavated measured 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. He did not dig straight down. Following his grandmother's precise instructions, he angled the floor at 3 degrees toward the rear wall and carved a drainage channel along the back edge that led to a vertical shaft descending another 4 feet into gravel. Any moisture that did accumulate would drain away from the wood, pulled by gravity into earth that would absorb it harmlessly. He had seen the same principle in root cellars back in Sweden, his grandmother had written, except those were designed to maintain humidity for vegetables. This was the opposite application. The drainage would ensure dryness instead of dampness. For the walls, Tobias used stones from the creek bed, 714 of them, by his count. He spent 2 weeks in early September hauling stones in a small handcart, selecting each one for flat surfaces that would stack without mortar. The work bent his back and bloodied his hands. Some days he could barely lift his arms by sunset. But every stone that found its place in the walls was one step closer to completing his grandmother's vision. His hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over until the skin became thick and rough as leather. He learned to read stones the way his grandmother had taught him to read clouds. This one had a flat face suitable for the outer wall. That one had a natural angle that would shed water. Another was too round, too likely to shift under pressure, and belonged in the drainage bed rather than the structural walls. 714 stones, each one chosen with care, each one placed with intention. On the coldest mornings when frost still lingered in the shadows and his breath hung visible in the air, Tobias would descend into the growing chamber and feel the difference immediately. Down here, the temperature was steady. Neither the heat of August nor the cold of approaching autumn penetrated more than a few inches into the earth. His grandmother had been right. The earth itself was a vast thermal battery, absorbing summer heat slowly and releasing it through winter. At the depth he was excavating, temperatures barely fluctuated at all. The journal had predicted 50 degrees year-round, and his own measurements, taken with a thermometer his grandmother had ordered from a catalog before her death, confirmed her calculations exactly. 51 degrees on a September morning when the surface temperature was 38, 52 degrees on an October afternoon when the sun had baked the prairie to 70. Consistent, stable, reliable. Exactly what Firewood needed to stay dry. He dry stacked the stones carefully, leaving quarter-inch gaps between them for air circulation. No moisture could build up if air moved through. His grandmother had observed the same thing in Henrik's stone fences back in Sweden. Mortared walls trapped moisture and cracked in winter freezes. But dry stacked walls breathed and lasted decades. The technique was ancient, passed down through generations of Norwegian and Swedish builders who understood that water was stone's greatest enemy. Anders Bjornstad noticed the walls during one of Helga's food deliveries. He was a stonemason by trade, a man who had spent 30 years building with stone before emigrating. He had dismissed the project as foolishness when he first heard about it, but curiosity eventually drew him to see for himself. He descended into the half-finished chamber on a cool September morning, running his calloused hands over the dry stacked walls. His experienced fingers found the gaps, traced the drainage paths, tested the stability of each course. "This is Norwegian building," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Dry stack. We have done this for centuries on coastal walls. I never thought to apply it underground for storage." He looked at Tobias with new eyes. "Where did you learn this?" "My grandmother's journal," Tobias said. "She wrote that every culture has something that works. The trick is combining them." Anders nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. "Your grandmother was a wise woman." He did not offer help. That would have been inappropriate given the settlement's consensus about the project, but he stopped dismissing it as foolishness, and that was something. The ceiling proved most critical. Tobias cut juniper poles from the river valley, 12 of them, each selected for straightness and strength. He placed them 18 inches apart across the chamber's width, creating a framework that could support significant weight. Over this framework, he laid a lattice of willow branches running perpendicular to the juniper poles. The result looked like a rough basket, open and irregular, but strong enough to hold the next layer. The next layer was his grandmother's innovation. She had developed a mixture specifically for this purpose. 3 parts clay soil, 2 parts dried grass, 1 part ash from the stove. Tobias followed her recipe exactly, mixing batches in a wooden trough and applying them to the lattice in careful layers. He tamped the mixture down to 4 inches thick and let it dry for 6 weeks. The waiting was harder than the work. Every day he checked the ceiling for cracks, for sagging, for any sign that the mixture was failing. Every night he lay awake listening for sounds of collapse. But the ceiling held. After 6 weeks, he added another 3-inch layer using the same technique. The result was a barrier that shed water like slate, but allowed vapor to pass through slowly enough that air currents carried it away before condensation could form. His grandmother had understood something that engineers would not formally document for another century: the difference between liquid water barriers and vapor-permeable membranes. The entry was a hinged trap door in his cabin floor. 30 inches square, framed with milled lumber he had traded butter and eggs for at the general store in Pembina. He lined the frame with wool strips salvaged from an old coat, sealing against drafts that could introduce temperature fluctuations. The door itself was double-layered, 3/4-inch planks on top, then a 2-inch air gap, then another layer beneath. Insulation mattered, even for a door that only opened once or twice a day. By the end of October, Tobias had created something the settlement had never seen: an underground storage chamber that maintained steady temperature, prevented moisture accumulation, and kept an entire winter's firewood supply accessible without leaving the warmth of his home. Now he just had to prove it worked. He invited the settlement to see the completed chamber in early November. 17 people climbing down through the trap door that afternoon, lanterns in hand, standing in the cool, dry space beneath the Tobias's cabin. They examined the walls, tested the ceiling with their hands, studied the drainage system with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Friedrich Krauss pushed hard against the stone walls. They did not budge. "How long did this take you?" he demanded. 4 months, Tobias said. "Working alone, 2 to 3 hours most days." "And you think this will save you effort?" Tobias met the older man's eyes without flinching. "I think it will save me from burying another family member because wet wood filled our cabin with smoke." The chamber went quiet. Nobody mentioned Henrik's death directly. Nobody mentioned that Astrid had devoted her final years to preventing exactly that tragedy from ever happening again. But everyone remembered. The losses were too recent, too raw, too close to home for anyone who had survived even one Dakota winter. Helga Bjornstad circled the chamber one more time, her practical eyes missing nothing. "The theory makes sense," she said finally. "But theory and a Dakota winter are 2 different things. What happens when the ground freezes? What if your drainage backs up? What if moisture from your cabin seeps through the floorboards and condenses down here?" Tobias nodded, accepting the questions as fair. "Then I will have failed," he said simply. "But I will have tried something different than stacking wood in a shed and hoping it stays dry." The visitors climbed back up into the cabin, brushed dirt from their clothes, and returned to their own homesteads. Most figured the boys' experiment would fail by Christmas. A few thought it might work, but was not worth the effort. None of them understood yet that his underground chamber would become the difference between survival and catastrophe. Birger Lundgren, a 38-year-old farmer with more confidence than sense, made the settlement's skepticism official and before everyone dispersed. "I will bet $5 that cellar collapses before the first real snow," he announced loud enough for everyone to hear. $5 says the boy is digging his own grave." Several men laughed. One of them, a younger farmer named Eric Thorson, matched the bet immediately. "I say it floods before it collapses. Water table is too high in these parts. That hole will be a well by December." More laughter, more bets. Within minutes, a small gambling pool had formed around the various ways Tobias Lindgren's project might fail. Collapse, flooding, mold, rot, condensation. Each failure mode had its champions, each skeptic confident in his particular prediction of disaster. Linnea Garrett, a 16-year-old girl who had been watching quietly from behind her mother, pushed through the crowd to stand beside Tobias. "Show me how the drainage works," she said, ignoring the adults entirely. "I want to understand why you angled the floor." The question caught Tobias off guard. No one had asked him to explain the design. I mean, everyone had simply told him why it would not work. "Water flows downhill," he said, finding his voice. "If any moisture gets into the chamber, it will run toward the back wall, into the drainage channel, and down into the gravel below. The water never touches the wood because the wood is stored on the high side of the floor." "What about water coming up from below?" Linnea asked. "Spring runoff? Snowmelt sinking into the soil?" "The gravel acts as a buffer. Water can move through gravel freely, but it does not wick up into the chamber the way it would through packed soil, and the drainage shaft goes 4 feet below the main floor, deep enough to reach the permanent water table where the pressure equalizes." Linnea nodded slowly, processing the explanation. "My father says you will fail," she said matter-of-factly. "He says no child can build something that will survive a Dakota winter." "What do you think?" Tobias asked. Linnea studied his face for a long moment. "I think my father has never read a book on thermodynamics, and I think your grandmother did. I think I would like to see your journal sometime, if you will let me." It was the beginning of a friendship that would eventually become something more, but that was years away. For now, Tobias simply nodded his agreement and watched Linnea Garrett disappear into the crowd of skeptics who were still laying bets on his failure. Tobias said nothing. He had learned from his grandmother that some bets could only be settled by time. Tobias began filling the chamber in mid-November. He had spent the summer months hauling wood from the river valley, ash, cottonwood, and elm. He had split it all by hand using a 6-pound maul and iron wedges, cutting each piece to 16-inch lengths that would fit his stove perfectly. The wood had dried through July, August, and September, stacked above ground in a covered crib with open sides. By early November, it was properly seasoned, under 20% moisture content. Each piece was light in the hand, with small cracks radiating from the cut ends that indicated thorough drying. He stacked it in the underground chamber using a method his grandmother had adapted from Swedish timber storage. Each piece was placed horizontally with quarter-inch gaps all around, allowing air circulation between every stick of wood. He built the pile in a crosshatch pattern, alternating directions with each layer. The result looked like a 3-dimensional lattice with more air than solid material. The entire winter's supply fit in the chamber with room to spare, 3.8 cords, enough for one person living alone, with margin for error. The number seemed abstract until Tobias considered what it represented. Each cord was a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. Each cord weighed roughly 2 tons when dry, far more when wet. Each cord represented countless hours of cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking. He had prepared all of it himself over the course of the summer. The memories of that work would stay with him for the rest of his life. The blisters that turned to calluses, the splinters that festered before he learned to remove them properly, the exhaustion that sometimes made him collapse beside the woodpile, too tired to eat, while Copper licked his face to keep him from sleeping there. His grandmother had helped as much as she could, but her strength had been failing even then. Mostly she had supervised, offered corrections, reminded him of techniques she had learned decades ago. She had sat in the shade and watched her grandson transform from a child into something harder, something more capable, something that could survive what was coming. She had known even then that she would not be there to share the fruits of his labor, but she had made sure he would not face winter without proper fuel. Now that fuel sat below his feet, arranged with obsessive care, waiting to prove that everything they had sacrificed had been worth it. He closed the trap door on November 15th and waited for winter. The rest of November brought early snow. 8 inches fell on the 19th, then another 6 on the 26th. Outside woodpiles now sat under snow cover, freezing and thawing with every temperature swing. The freeze-thaw cycle that Astrid had documented so carefully in her journal was beginning its destructive work. Some settlers brought wood into their cabins to dry near the stove, sacrificing precious living space for fuel quality. Others burned through their driest wood first, knowing the rest would only get worse as winter deepened. Tobias opened his trap door once a week to check. The wood remained dry. The chamber's temperature held steady at 51 degrees Fahrenheit, while outside temperatures swung from 34 down to 8 below zero. No condensation formed on the ceiling. The drainage channel remained empty. Air circulating through the stone walls carried away any moisture before it could condense. His grandmother's design was working exactly as she had predicted. Tobias burned his first underground wood on November 28th. It lit easily. It burned clean. It produced minimal smoke. The heat output was exactly what his grandmother had calculated. One 16-inch piece of dry ash produced approximately 6,800 BTUs. That same piece, if wet, would produce maybe 4,200 BTUs and twice the smoke. Over a winter, burning 3 to 4 pieces per hour for 16 hours a day, the difference compounded into something enormous. Dry wood meant warmth. Wet wood meant suffering. And smoke, as Tobias knew better than anyone, could mean death. He thought about his father constantly that November, as the first cold settled over the prairie and smoke began rising from chimneys throughout the settlement. Henrik Lindgren had been a dreamer, his grandmother had told him, a man who believed that education and hard work could overcome any obstacle, that America offered opportunities unavailable in the rigid class structures of Sweden. Henrik had been right about opportunity. He had been wrong about preparedness. The family's first winter in Dakota had caught them unprepared. They had underestimated the cold, the wind, the relentless assault of weather that seemed determined to kill anything foolish enough to challenge it. They had stored their firewood the way everyone else did, stacked outside under a simple lean-to roof, exposed to every rain and every snow and every freeze-thaw cycle that the prairie could deliver. The wood had absorbed moisture all autumn. By January, it burned poorly. By February, the smoke had become thick enough to choke on. By March, Henrik was dead. Tobias had only fragments of memory from that terrible time. The sound of coughing in the night, the smell of bustamung that never quite cleared, his mother crying in the corner of the cabin, holding Henrik's hand as he struggled for breath. And then silence. And then the grave. And then the Wumistong years with his grandmother, learning everything she knew, becoming the repository of knowledge she had gathered, preparing for a winter that he would face alone. Tobias fed his stove with perfectly dry ash wood and listened to the wind howl outside and understood that his grandmother had given him something more valuable than gold. She had given him the ability to survive. December tested everyone. Temperatures dropped to 19 degrees below zero, then 24 below. Then on December 18th, 31 degrees below zero, with winds at 35 miles per hour. Wind chill, though the term would not exist for another century, would have registered somewhere near 65 degrees below zero. This was when the settlement learned what Tobias had understood from the beginning. This was when firewood quality stopped being a convenience issue and became a survival issue. Thousands of you have joined us in documenting these frontier innovations. If you have not subscribed yet, consider doing it now. We are preserving knowledge that is disappearing as the last people who remember these techniques pass away. This is not just history. It is practical wisdom that still applies today. Magnus Arneson's family began coughing on December 20th. His wood was burning poorly. Too much moisture, incomplete combustion, heavy smoke that hung in the cabin air like a gray curtain. His wife Ingrid developed a rattling cough that kept her awake at night. Their youngest son, 4-year-old Stellan, could not stop wheezing. Magnus tried burning hotter to compensate. But wet wood just produced more smoke, and the cabin's ventilation could not clear it fast enough. By December 23rd, Stellan's breathing had worsened dramatically. The boy's chest heaved with every breath. His lips had taken on a bluish tinge that terrified his mother. He could not eat, could barely drink, could not sleep for more than a few minutes before waking in a coughing fit that left him gasping. Ingrid Arneson sat beside her son's bed and prayed in Norwegian, the language of her childhood, the language of desperation. She had already lost 2 children to fever before emigrating. She had buried babies in Swedish soil and sworn she would never bury another. Now she watched her youngest struggle for every breath, and she knew the smoke was from Smoke was killing him. "We have to do something," she told Magnus. "We cannot just watch him die." Magnus knew there was only one place in the settlement with dry wood. He knew whose door he would have to knock on. The pride that had kept him from acknowledging the orphan boy's achievement now seemed ridiculous in the face of his son's rattling breath. What was pride worth? What was being right worth? Nothing. Nothing at all if Stellan died. Magnus had seen death on the Norwegian coast. He had watched men drown in storms, seen children taken by fever, buried friends who had not survived the crossing to America. He knew what dying looked like, and his son was dying. The walk to Tobias Lindgren's cabin was half a mile through snow and wind. Magnus made it in the darkness after sunset, arriving at the orphan boy's door with frost on his beard and desperation in his eyes. Tobias opened the door and saw his neighbor's face in the lamplight. He did not need to ask what was wrong. "I need dry wood," Magnus said, his voice cracking with emotion he would never normally show. "Stellan cannot breathe. The smoke is killing him." His hands were shaking. Whether from cold or fear or shame, Tobias could not tell. "Please," Magnus added, and the words seemed to cost him everything. Tobias did not hesitate. He did not remind Magnus of the mockery. He did not mention the warnings about damp and mold and foolishness. He did not ask for apologies or payment or acknowledgement that he had been right all along. He thought of his father. Henrik Lindgren had died in a cabin full of smoke, coughing out his last breaths while his mother held him and his grandmother watched helplessly. He had been 32 years old, a school teacher who had dreamed of building a better life in America. He had survived the ocean crossing, survived the journey west, survived the back-breaking work of establishing a homestead. He had not survived wet firewood. Tobias remembered standing beside his father's grave at the age of 5, too young to fully understand what death meant, old enough to remember the sound of his mother sobbing. No one else should have to bury their father. No other boy should have to stand beside a grave and wonder why. Tobias simply opened the trap door, climbed down into his underground chamber, and began handing up armloads of perfectly dry ash wood. One armload, then another, then a third. "Take what you need," Tobias said, his 12-year-old voice steady and calm. "Come back tomorrow if you need more." Magnus stared at the wood in his arms. It was completely dry, lighter than his own wet fuel, ready to burn clean and hot. "I told you this would not work," he said quietly, shame heavy in his voice. "You were wrong," Tobias said simply. "We all are sometimes. Take the wood home." Magnus carried it back through the darkness, loaded it into a stove, and within an hour Stellan's breathing had eased. The cabin aired out. The smoke cleared. The child slept through the night for the first time in 3 days. Ingrid wept with relief. She had prepared herself to bury another child. She had steeled herself for the grief she knew too well, the hollow ache that never quite faded even decades after the loss. She had prayed and bargained and begged God for mercy, and she had received none of those things. What she had received was dry firewood from a 12-year-old orphan who had every reason to turn them away. "The boy saved him," she told Magnus. "The boy you called foolish. The boy whose grandmother you said was wasting her final years on nonsense." Magnus did not argue. There was nothing to argue about. He had been wrong, and his son had nearly died because of it. The next morning, when the sun rose over a prairie still locked in ice, Magnus walked back to Tobias's cabin. Not to ask for more wood, not yet, simply to stand in the doorway and say the words that needed to be said. "Thank you," he managed. "You saved my son." Tobias nodded, his young face showing no triumph, no vindication. "Come back when you need more wood," he said. "There is enough for everyone." By Christmas morning, word had spread through the settlement. Tobias Lindgren had wood that actually worked. The winter of 1878 to 79 became legendary in Pembina County. January brought temperatures that hit 38 degrees below zero and stayed there for 6 straight days. February added 3 blizzards, each lasting more than 40 hours. Homesteaders who had survived previous winters said this one was different, longer, colder, more relentless, and wood piles across Cavalier Creek began failing. It was not just wetness. It was the freeze-thaw cycle combined with snow accumulation and inadequate storage. Wood that had seemed acceptably dry in November held dangerous levels of moisture by January. Wood that had lit readily in December smoldered and smoked in February. Families burned through their supplies faster because wet wood produced less heat. They compensated by burning more. But that just meant running out sooner. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. A family that had prepared 4 cords for winter expected each cord to last roughly a month. But wet wood produced perhaps 60% of the heat that dry wood produced. That meant the same family would burn through their 4 cords in less than 2.5 months, leaving them with nothing when the worst cold arrived in February and March. Some families began rationing immediately, keeping their cabins at barely survivable temperatures to stretch their supply. Children slept in layers of clothing, their breath visible even indoors. Elderly members of households developed coughs that refused to go away. Water left out overnight froze solid and stayed frozen even during daylight hours. Other families burned freely and hoped for an early spring. They lived in relative comfort through December and January, then faced catastrophe when their wood piles dwindled to nothing while blizzards still raged outside. Neither approach was sustainable. Neither approach would have saved them without intervention. The settlement needed dry wood, and there was only one place to get it. Friedrich Krause's family faced the crisis first. By February 8th, they had burned through most of their supply. What remained was largely useless. Moisture content above 35%, effectively unburnable. The former Prussian soldier who had mocked a 12-year-old boy's efforts now faced the humiliating prospect of asking that same boy for help. He arrived at Tobias's cabin in the afternoon, his military bearing slightly diminished by circumstances. Tobias was hauling up wood from the underground chamber when Friedrich appeared. The trap door stood open, revealing the latticed stack of fuel below. Friedrich could see that it was still dry, still perfectly preserved, still exactly what his family needed to survive. "I misjudged you," Friedrich said without preamble. "I need to buy wood." His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent decades mastering his emotions. But his eyes betrayed him. Behind the rigid military bearing, behind the proud posture, there was fear. Real fear. The kind of fear that makes men do things they never thought they would do. Tobias looked at the man who had dismissed him as foolish, who had announced that even grown men could not accomplish what a child was attempting, who had laughed with the others at the orphan boy's grief-driven project. He saw something else now. He saw a father terrified for his family. He saw a man who had built his identity on competence and strength, now confronting the reality that competence and strength were not enough to survive a Dakota winter without dry fuel. "I am not selling," Tobias said. Friedrich's face darkened with anger and fear. "Then why am I here?" "You are here to take what you need, no barge. But you will help me restock come spring." Friedrich stared at the boy who was offering him survival without demanding humiliation in return. "You are just giving it to me?" His voice cracked slightly on the last word. For a moment, the mask slipped, and Tobias saw the human being behind the soldier's facade. A man who loved his family. A man who had crossed an ocean to give them a better life. A man who was failing to keep them warm, and knew it, and hated himself for it. Tobias thought of his father, dead from smoke inhalation in a cabin that should have been warm and dry. He thought of his grandmother, who had spent her final years designing a solution so that no one else would have to die the way Henrik had died. "My father and grandmother nearly froze their first winter here because they did not know what they were doing," Tobias said. "A man named Lars Johansson brought us wood and would not take payment. He said neighbors do not charge for survival. I am doing what Lars did." Friedrich loaded an ox cart with dry wood, enough for 2 weeks. He returned on February 22nd for more, then March 8th. Each time, Tobias opened the trap door and handed up fuel that burned clean and hot, asking nothing in return except help restocking when the weather broke. The underground chamber became Cavalier Creek's emergency reserve. Between February and April of 1879, Tobias supplied dry firewood to 14 families. Not all of them had mocked his construction project, but all of them had doubted it would work. Now it was keeping their children alive. The work was exhausting. Every distribution required descending into the chamber, selecting appropriate pieces, hauling them up through the trap door, and loading them onto whatever conveyance the recipient had brought. Some days Tobias made 3 or 4 distributions. Some nights he fell into bed so tired that Copper had to nudge him awake the next morning. But he never complained, he never asked for rest, he never turned anyone away. Linnea Garrett came to help during the worst of it. Her father had initially forbidden her involvement, but the girl had a stubborn streak that matched Tobias's own. She arrived one February morning with a determined expression and a pair of heavy gloves. "You cannot do this alone forever," she told him. "Show me how to select the driest pieces. Show me how much each family needs. Let me help." Tobias hesitated. "Your father will not approve." "My father has not approved of anything interesting I have ever done," Linnea replied. "That has not stopped me yet. Now show me the system." They worked together through February and into March, developing a routine that maximized efficiency. Linnea kept records of who received how much, ensuring fair distribution. Tobias focused on the physical labor, hauling and stacking and delivering. Copper supervised both of them, tail wagging whenever visitors arrived. The partnership surprised no one who knew them. They had been drawn to each other since that first afternoon in the completed chamber, when Linnea had asked questions while everyone else had placed bets. Their friendship had grown through correspondence during the intervening months. Letters that discussed thermodynamics and drainage, and the frustrating tendency of adults to dismiss ideas they did not understand. Now they worked side by side, keeping a settlement alive through a winter that seemed determined to destroy it. There is something profound in this story that I want you to consider. A 12-year-old orphan, working alone for 4 months, dug a hole beneath his cabin and created infrastructure that saved 14 families. He did not ask permission. He did not wait for consensus. He identified a problem, designed a solution from his grandmother's research, and executed it by himself. Then, when crisis came, he shared what he had built. If you believe that kind of practical wisdom still matters, if you believe that documenting how people solved real problems with limited resources teaches us something valuable about human resilience, then subscribe to this channel. We are preserving these stories before they disappear forever. Magnus Arneson came back 4 times over the course of that terrible winter. Each time he tried to pay. Each time Tobias refused. "Build one yourself next summer," the boy told him. "That is payment enough." Helga Bjornstad arrived on March 2nd with her husband Anders. They had managed better than most. Her enclosed shed had kept wood relatively dry, and Anders' expertise had helped them prepare more effectively than their neighbors. But now they were running short, and what remained was marginal quality at best. Helga examined the underground chamber with new eyes, seeing it now not as a curiosity but as critical infrastructure. She traced the drainage channel with her finger, studied the ceiling's vapor barrier, checked the stone walls for any sign of dampness. She found none. "This is engineering," she said finally, her voice carrying respect that had been absent during her earlier visits. "Real engineering, not just digging a hole." "It is observation and adaptation," Tobias said, using words his grandmother had taught him. "Same thing my grandmother taught me for everything else. Watch what fails. Ask why. Try something different." Anders Bjornstad, who had spent 30 years building with stone, ran his experienced hands over the dry stacked walls one more time. "I have never seen these principles combined so effectively," he said. "The drainage, the air circulation, the vapor barrier. Your grandmother understood something that most builders miss. She worked with the earth instead of fighting against it." "Every culture has something that works," Tobias said. "The trick is combining them." It was the clearest articulation of his grandmother's philosophy. The underground chamber was not purely Swedish or Norwegian or German. It was an adaptation of techniques from multiple traditions. Stonework from Norse builders, vapor barriers from Swedish timber storage, drainage from German root cellars, all modified for prairie conditions and a specific problem: keeping firewood dry through a Dakota winter. Helga looked at her husband, then at the boy who had taught them something new. "When this winter is over," she said, "you are coming to live with us." Tobias had not expected that. He had not allowed himself to think about what would happen after winter. He had focused entirely on survival, on completing his grandmother's project, on proving that her design would work. The loneliness that waited on the other side of survival was something he had pushed away, refused to examine, locked in a corner of his mind where it could not distract him. Now it came flooding back. 7 months alone, 7 months of cooking his own meals and mending his own clothes and lying awake at night, listening to the wind howl across the empty prairie. 7 months of missing his grandmother's voice, her laugh, the way she would hum Swedish folk songs while she worked. 7 months of being the only person who cared whether he lived or died. "I have my grandmother's cabin," he said uncertainly, his voice smaller than he intended. "You have a cabin," Helga agreed, "but you need a family. Anders and I have discussed it. You will keep the cabin, keep the land, keep everything your grandmother left you. But you will eat with us, sleep under a roof where someone checks on you. Be part of something larger than yourself." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said everything, as if the decision had already been made and was simply being communicated. "Why?" Tobias asked. "Because your grandmother would have wanted it," Helga said. "And because you saved my children's lives this winter with wood you could have kept for yourself. That is not something I forget." She paused, and her practical expression softened slightly. "And because no 12-year-old should have to survive winter alone. You have proven you can do it. You do not have to prove it again." Tobias felt tears threatening, the first he had allowed himself since his grandmother's funeral. "Thank you," he managed. Helga nodded once. The matter settled. "Now show me exactly how the drainage system works. I want to understand this properly before we build our own." If this story has moved you, if you see yourself in the determination of a boy who refused to give up, or in the wisdom of a grandmother who planned for the future she would not see, then take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We tell stories like this because they matter, because the people who built this country deserve to be remembered, because their ingenuity and courage still have something to teach us. By April, when the winter finally broke, every family at Cavalier Creek had survived. 3 families would have frozen without Tobias's dry wood. 4 others had avoided serious illness by reducing smoke exposure during the worst of the crisis. The settlement had learned that firewood quality was not a convenience issue. It was life and death, and they had learned that an underground storage chamber, properly designed, solved multiple problems simultaneously. The skeptics faced a reckoning. Birger Lundgren, who had bet $5 on the chamber's collapse, paid his debt silently and never spoke of the wager again. He spent the summer building his own chamber, following Tobias's design exactly, and became one of its most vocal advocates in the years that followed. Sometimes the strongest believers were those who had doubted hardest. Reverend Holmberg preached a sermon that May about the sin of dismissing wisdom because it came from unexpected sources. He did not name Tobias directly, but everyone in the congregation understood. The Reverend had learned something that winter about the difference between traditional knowledge and practical knowledge, and about the danger of assuming God's intentions rather than observing his creation. Ingrid Dahl, the woman who had declared that Tobias would not survive until Christmas, found herself unable to meet the boy's eyes when they passed on the street. She had been wrong about him, wrong about his grandmother, wrong about everything. In June, she brought a basket of preserves to his cabin and left it on the doorstep without knocking. It was not an apology in words, but Tobias understood what it meant. He ate the preserves and never mentioned them to anyone. Magnus Arneson became Tobias's most steadfast ally. The man who had first warned about moisture and mold now spent hours helping the boy plan improvements to the original design. His shipbuilding background proved valuable for calculating load tolerances and drainage flow rates. The shame of that desperate walk through the December darkness had transformed into something else, something more useful than shame: gratitude, respect, and eventually, friendship. "I was wrong about you," Magnus told Tobias one spring afternoon, as they worked together hauling stones for a neighbor's new chamber. "I saw a boy trying to build something beyond his ability. I should have seen a boy honoring his grandmother's wisdom." "You saw what made sense to see," Tobias replied. "I was young and alone and working on something no one else understood. You were right to be skeptical. You were just wrong about the conclusion." Magnus shook his head slowly. Your grandmother raised you well. Most boys your age would have demanded apologies. Most men my age would have demanded them. Apologies do not keep houses warm, Tobias said. Help does. You are here helping. That matters more than words. The following summer, 7 families built their own underground chambers. Magnus Arneson constructed one 14 feet long and 9 feet wide, slightly larger than Tobias's design. He improved the drainage by adding a second vertical shaft and connecting them with a U-bend that prevented cold air from flowing backward into the chamber. Friedrich Krauss, drawing on his military engineering background, designed a chamber with curved walls that distributed structural loads more efficiently than Tobias's straight walls. He would never admit that a 12-year-old had taught him something, but he incorporated every principle from the boy's design into his own construction. His chamber became something of a local attraction. Neighbors came to see the curved walls, to understand how the military principles of fortification could be adapted for civilian storage. Friedrich explained his modifications with the same certainty he had once used to dismiss Tobias's project, but now his certainty served to spread innovation rather than stifle it. The boy had the concept right, Friedrich would tell visitors, which was the closest he ever came to direct acknowledgement. I simply applied proper engineering refinements. Tobias never contradicted him. What mattered was that the knowledge spread, not who received credit for it. Helga and Anders Bjornstad built theirs with a dual purpose: firewood storage in winter, root vegetable storage in summer. The stable temperature that kept wood dry also kept vegetables fresh for months longer than above-ground storage allowed. Their design became the template for farm families throughout the region. Carrots stored in the Bjornstad chamber in October remained crisp and edible in April. Potatoes lasted until the following harvest without sprouting or rotting. The chamber that Tobias had built for survival became, in their adaptation, a tool for prosperity. Other families modified the design in their own ways. One homesteader added a separate compartment for storing ice cut from the river, creating year-round refrigeration that allowed dairy storage through summer months. Another connected 2 chambers with an underground passage, creating a thermal network that shared temperature stability between buildings. A third experimented with ventilation pipes that drew fresh air through the earth itself, cooling it naturally before it entered the living space. Innovation built upon innovation, each adaptation teaching the next builder something new. That was how progress worked on the frontier, not through patents and proprietary secrets, but through observation, experimentation, and generous sharing of results. Each design varied slightly, adapted to individual cabin layouts and soil conditions, but all followed Tobias's core principles: depth below frost line, drainage for moisture, air circulation through stone walls, vapor-permeable ceiling, insulated entry. By 1882, 19 of the 23 families at Cavalier Creek had underground storage chambers. The 4 who did not lived in locations where high water tables or bedrock made excavation impossible. Those families built heavily insulated above-ground structures based on the same thermal mass principles: thick sod walls, layered roofs, controlled ventilation. The physics were the same, even if the construction was different. The winter of 1882 to 83 brought another severe cold snap. Temperatures dropped to 42 degrees below zero. Sustained winds piled snow into drifts that buried entire cabins. Families who had survived previous winters said this one matched the legendary winter of 1878 to 79 for sheer brutality. But this time, no families faced fuel crisis. The underground chambers performed exactly as Tobias had predicted: stable temperature, dry wood, easy access, no structural problems even after 4 years of use. Word spread beyond Cavalier Creek. Homesteaders from neighboring settlements visited to see the chambers. A reporter from the Pembina Pioneer Express wrote a 1,200-word article about the ingenious fuel preservation system pioneered by young Tobias Lindgren and his late grandmother in October of 1883. The article included sketches and measurements. Families across northern Dakota began excavating their own chambers. The article circulated far beyond the local area. Farmers in Montana wrote letters asking for more detailed specifications. An agricultural college in Minnesota requested permission to study the design. A Norwegian immigrant newspaper in Minneapolis reprinted the story with additional illustrations, connecting the innovation to traditional Scandinavian building practices. Tobias found himself answering correspondence from strangers. He had never expected fame. He had simply wanted to survive the winter using his grandmother's design. Now people he had never met were writing to thank him for saving their families with techniques they had learned from a newspaper article about a 12-year-old orphan. He kept every letter in a wooden box that had belonged to his grandmother, hundreds of them over the years, each one a life touched by knowledge that Astrid had gathered and Tobias had implemented and both of them had shared. The technique spread faster than most innovations because it solved a universal problem with locally available materials and labor. You did not need milled lumber, purchased hardware, or specialized tools. You needed a shovel, stones, clay soil, and willingness to dig. In a region where homesteaders built most of their infrastructure by hand, that made the underground chamber accessible to nearly everyone. By 1890, underground firewood storage had become common throughout Dakota, Montana, and parts of Minnesota. The designs evolved over time. Some builders incorporated stone pillars for additional ceiling support. Others added ventilation pipes to enhance air circulation. A few ambitious homesteaders created multi-chamber systems with separate zones for different wood types. But the fundamental concept remained what Tobias and his grandmother had established. Use the Earth's thermal stability to maintain dry storage without external energy input. Work with natural systems instead of against them. Tobias Lindgren lived at Cavalier Creek until 1925. He was officially adopted by Helga and Anders Bjornstad in 1880, becoming part of their family while maintaining ownership of his grandmother's cabin and land. He learned stonework from Anders, eventually becoming skilled enough to hire out his services to other settlements. He married Linnea Garrett in 1890. She was the girl who had asked so many questions during the construction years, who had wanted to understand the physics instead of just accepting the results. While others had placed bets on his failure, she had asked to see his grandmother's journal. While others had laughed at the orphan boy's ambitions, she had learned alongside him. Their courtship was unconventional by frontier standards. Instead of dances and church socials, they spent evenings discussing thermodynamics and structural engineering. Instead of romantic poetry, Tobias gave her copies of his grandmother's technical notes, annotated with his own observations from years of refinement. Instead of flowers, Linnea brought him academic papers she had ordered from the university library in Minneapolis, articles about soil mechanics and moisture dynamics that validated what Astrid had discovered through observation alone. They understood each other in ways that no one else could. Both had spent their childhoods asking questions that adults dismissed as irrelevant or impossible. Both had learned to trust observation over tradition. Both had experienced the particular loneliness of seeing the patterns that others refused to acknowledge. When Tobias proposed, he did so in the underground chamber he had built as a 12-year-old orphan. "This place saved my life," he told her. "But it was always meant to save more lives than just mine. My grandmother designed it for a family. I would like that family to include you." Linnea said yes without hesitation. They built their own home together, incorporating an underground storage chamber twice the size of his grandmother's original design. They raised 4 children. All of them survived to adulthood, a remarkable achievement in that time and place. And all of them learned to dig. Copper, the hunting dog who had been Tobias's only companion during those long months of construction, lived to the age of 14. He died in 1888, peacefully, in front of the stove where he had spent countless winter evenings at Tobias's feet. The palm had been a gift from his grandmother, purchased from a neighbor when Tobias was 9 years old. Astrid had recognized that the boy needed a companion, something living and warm, that would be there through the long hours of chores and the longer hours of darkness. Copper had never been a particularly remarkable dog. He was not especially clever or obedient or skilled at hunting. He was simply present. He was simply loyal. He was simply there every morning when Tobias woke and every evening when Tobias returned from work, tail wagging, brown eyes bright with uncomplicated affection. During the months of construction, Copper had lain at the edge of the excavation and watched Tobias work. He had barked at skeptical visitors and wagged his tail at Linnea's arrival. He had descended into the finished chamber and curled up in the corner, as if claiming his place in the space his master had built. When Tobias handed wood up to desperate neighbors that terrible winter, Copper had stood beside him, a silent witness to acts of generosity that would reshape the settlement. They buried him beside the cabin, under a cottonwood tree that Tobias had planted the year after his grandmother died. The grave marker was simple: Copper, faithful friend, 1875 to 1888. Tobias himself lived to be 65 years old. He died in 1931, having survived 47 Dakota winters using the techniques his grandmother had developed and he had implemented. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his underground storage innovation, noting that variations of his design were still in use throughout the northern plains. The obituary also noted something that the newspaper article 48 years earlier had not emphasized. Tobias Lindgren had never charged anyone for his expertise. He had spent decades teaching neighbors, corresponding with strangers, and helping anyone who asked. He had treated his grandmother's knowledge not as a proprietary advantage, but as a gift meant to be shared. The funeral was held on a cold November day, fitting for a man whose life had been defined by understanding cold. More than 200 people attended, many of them strangers who had built chambers based on his instructions, or children of people he had helped decades earlier, or simply community members who remembered the winter of 1878 to 79 and the 12-year-old orphan who had saved 14 families. Linnea outlived him by 12 years, dying in 1943 at the age of 81. She spent her final years organizing his papers and ensuring that his grandmother's journal and the hundreds of letters he had received would be preserved for future generations. His granddaughter Clara discovered Astrid's original journal among his possessions. She donated it to the North Dakota State Historical Society, where it remains today. The settlement at Cavalier Creek exists today as Cavalier, North Dakota, population 123. Most homes now have central heating, natural gas, and electricity. The original sod houses are long gone, replaced by modern construction that would be unrecognizable to the homesteaders of 1878. But dig in the right backyards, and you will still find the stone-lined chambers beneath old home sites. The stones are there, the drainage systems intact, the structures sound after nearly 150 years. In 2016, archaeologists from the University of North Dakota excavated the site of Tobias's original cabin. They found the underground chamber exactly where land records indicated it should be. The dry stacked stone walls had not shifted. The drainage channel still functioned. The ceiling's clay layer, though cracked in places, remained largely intact. They measured the chamber's internal temperature on a July day when outside air hit 89 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the chamber, the temperature was 52 degrees. The thermal stability that Astrid Lindgren had relied on, that Tobias had trusted with his survival, still existed 138 years later. The Earth does not change. The physics does not change. Only human knowledge of how to work with natural systems changes, and sometimes that knowledge gets lost. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Karen Halvorson, was herself the great-granddaughter of Norwegian immigrants. She understood what she was looking at in ways that purely academic researchers might have missed. "This is not primitive construction," she wrote in her preliminary report. "This is sophisticated engineering adapted to local conditions. The drainage system alone demonstrates understanding of hydrology that would not be formally documented for another century. The vapor management shows intuitive grasp of thermodynamics that most modern builders still get wrong." She traced the construction back through historical records and found the newspaper article from 1883. She found the letters that Clara had donated. She found the journal, carefully preserved, its pages still legible after nearly 150 years. Astrid Lindgren was a scientist, Dr. Halvorson concluded. She simply did not know to call herself one. And her grandson was an engineer. They solved problems using observation, experimentation, and documentation. That is the scientific method, regardless of whether they had formal training. The university created a small exhibit about the Lindgren chamber. It attracted more interest than anyone expected. Modern homesteaders in cold climates have rediscovered underground storage independently. In Alaska, Montana, and northern Canada, builders create similar chambers for fuel, tools, and supplies that need temperature stability without energy input. They call them earth-bermed storage or underground cold rooms. The physics remains identical to what Astrid understood in the 1870s and Tobias implemented in 1878. Earth below frost line maintains constant temperature. Proper drainage prevents moisture accumulation. Air circulation prevents condensation. Thermal mass buffers temperature swings. Contemporary sustainable building has formalized these principles under technical names: earth-sheltered architecture, passive annual heat storage, ground source thermal mass. They all exploit the same physical properties that a Swedish immigrant grandmother and her orphaned grandson use for firewood storage. The earth 4 feet down in Pembina County maintains 48 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. That is not folklore or approximation. That is thermodynamics. The skeptics at Cavalier Creek were not wrong to doubt. Innovation on the frontier carried real risk. Resources were scarce. Labor was precious. Failure could mean death. Caution made sense in a world where one bad decision could destroy everything you had worked to build. But Tobias's approach made equal sense. Careful observation, measured adaptation, willingness to test new solutions. He did not gamble wildly on untested ideas. He followed his grandmother's documented research, applied principles she had validated through years of observation, and tested the chamber thoroughly before relying on it entirely. That combination of empirical thinking and practical execution defined successful frontier settlement. The families who thrived were not those who followed tradition blindly or innovated recklessly. They were the ones who observed what worked, understood why it worked, and adapted when conditions demanded something different. Astrid's underground chamber worked because it aligned with natural systems rather than fighting them. She did not try to heat the wood or force it to stay dry through some mechanical intervention. She simply placed it where temperatures stayed stable and moisture could not accumulate. She let physics do the work. That principle, working with natural systems instead of against them, underlies most successful frontier adaptation. The sod house works because prairie sod provides insulation. The windmill works because prairie wind is constant. Dry farming works because deep roots access subsurface moisture. The best innovations did not conquer nature. They cooperated with it. When Tobias invited his skeptical neighbors into his underground chamber in November of 1878, he was not trying to prove them wrong. He was not seeking vindication or demanding apologies. He was offering an alternative approach to a problem that affected everyone. Take it or leave it. Test it yourself. Adapt it to your situation. His grandmother had taught him that knowledge hoarded was knowledge wasted. The techniques she had gathered from Swedish timber traditions, from Norwegian stonework, from German root cellars, none of that belonged to her. It belonged to everyone who needed it. Her only contribution was synthesis, the recognition that combining different approaches could solve problems that no single tradition addressed. Tobias inherited that philosophy along with the journal and the half-dug hole. He shared his grandmother's design freely, helped others build their own chambers, and never claimed credit or compensation. When farmers from other counties wrote asking for specifications, he replied with detailed letters that included every measurement, every material, every technique he had learned. When agricultural researchers visited to study the design, he opened his chamber for inspection without requesting payment or acknowledgement. The knowledge was meant to be shared. That was the whole point. That generosity characterized much of frontier innovation. Knowledge spread because people shared it. Techniques improved because builders adapted them. Communities survived because neighbors helped neighbors. The underground storage chamber worked not just as technology, but as shared resource. Tobias's surplus became the settlement's emergency reserve. His willingness to give without demanding return became the model for how Cavalier Creek would approach community crisis for generations to come. A 12-year-old orphan, working alone, dug a hole beneath his cabin and created infrastructure that saved 14 families. He did not ask permission. He did not wait for consensus. He identified a problem, followed his grandmother's research, and executed the solution with his own hands. Then, when crisis came, he shared what he had built without demanding anything in return. That cycle of innovation, skepticism, Testing, validation, adaptation, and improvement drove frontier development more than any government program or corporate investment. Individual settlers identified problems, experimented with solutions, shared what worked, and collectively raised the standard of living for everyone. Tobias's chamber represents that process in miniature. He saw wet wood causing suffering and death. He found his grandmother's solution in her journal. He built it himself despite mockery. He proved it worked through one of the harshest winters on record. He shared it freely with everyone who needed it. Others adopted and improved the design. Within a decade, an entire region had better winter fuel storage because one orphan boy refused to accept that stacking wood in a shed was the only option. The lesson is not that underground storage chambers are universally superior. The lesson is that careful observation, empirical testing, and willingness to share knowledge create progress. Astrid did not discover new physics. She applied existing principles to a specific problem. Tobias did not invent new construction techniques. He combined known methods in new ways to solve local problems. That is how communities advance. Most frontier innovations emerge that way. The steel plow combined existing metallurgy with new design. Barbed wire combined thorns and wire into novel configuration. Dry farming combined deep plowing with crop rotation. Underground firewood storage combined thermal mass, drainage, and air circulation into an integrated system. None of these innovations required scientific breakthroughs. They required attention, thought, and execution. They required people who looked at existing problems and asked whether the current solution was actually the best option. That question might be the most important legacy Astrid and Tobias left behind. Not the chamber itself, but the thinking behind it. The refusal to accept inadequate results just because that is how things had always been done. The confidence to trust observation over assumption. The humility to test carefully before committing fully. The generosity to share what worked. Those qualities built the frontier more than any single technology, and they remain relevant now, in different contexts, facing different challenges. The specifics change. We are not hauling firewood from river valleys or heating sod houses through Dakota winters, but the approach endures. Observe carefully, think clearly, test honestly, share freely. If you believe that approach still matters, if you believe that documenting how people solved real problems with limited resources teaches us something valuable about human ingenuity and resilience, then subscribe to this channel. Help us preserve these stories. There are thousands more like Tobias Lindgren buried in old newspapers, land records, and family histories, waiting to be told. Each one offers a glimpse of people doing the hard work of survival with intelligence, courage, and community. That is worth remembering. That is worth sharing. Tobias Lindgren's underground chamber stands as proof that one person, thinking clearly about a specific problem, can create something that outlasts them and serves others long after they are gone. Not through grand vision or dramatic gesture, but through patient observation and practical action. That might be the most frontier quality of all, the quiet competence that changes everything without announcing itself. His firewood never got wet because he understood physics and was not afraid to dig beneath his own floor to apply that understanding. His neighbors survived because he shared what he had built when they needed it most. And nearly 150 years later, we can still measure the chamber he excavated by hand and confirm that he was right all along. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones we build ourselves beneath our feet, where others do not think to look. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is not money or land or possessions. Sometimes it is knowledge, carefully recorded, patiently taught, and bravely implemented by those who come after. Astrid Lindgren knew she was dying. She had felt the weakness growing throughout that final summer, the breathlessness that came with smaller and smaller exertions, the fatigue that no amount of rest could cure. She had seen enough death to recognize its approach. She had buried her husband decades ago, had buried her son just 7 years past. She knew the signs, but she was not afraid. Fear is for those who leave things unfinished. Astrid Lindgren had one task remaining, one final gift to give the grandson who had become her reason for living. She could not be there to guide him through his first winter alone. She could not be there to help him face the skeptics or navigate the loneliness or solve the problems that would inevitably arise. But she could give him knowledge. She could give him a foundation, literally and figuratively, upon which to build his survival. So she dug a hole. She filled a journal with everything she knew, and she trusted her grandson to finish what she had started. That trust was not misplaced. Tobias Lindgren was 12 years old and completely alone, but he had everything he needed. He had the memory of 7 years of patient teaching. He had the journal filled with his grandmother's careful observations. He had the foundation she had begun to dig. He had the stubbornness to continue when others laughed. He had the generosity to share when others suffered. He had, in short, exactly what his grandmother had given him, the tools to build a life. And that made all the difference. In the end, the underground chamber was never really about firewood. It was about what one generation passes to the next. It was about knowledge preserved through love and implemented through courage. It was about a grandmother who refused to let her grandson face winter unprepared, and a grandson who honored that refusal by completing her work. It was about family, even when the family was reduced to a boy, a dween, and the memory of those who came before. Especially then. The stones that Tobias placed still stand after nearly 150 years. The drainage channels still function. The temperature inside that chamber remains stable through every season, exactly as Astrid predicted it would. But the true legacy is not the chamber itself. The true legacy is the knowledge that spread from it, the families that survived because they learned from a 12-year-old orphan, the communities that thrived because they shared what worked, the innovations that emerged because builders felt free to adapt and improve upon designs that were offered without restriction. That is what Astrid really left her grandson, not just a hole in the ground and a book of instructions, but a way of being in the world. Observe carefully, think clearly, test honestly, share freely. Those 4 principles built the frontier. They can build anything.